and he is the dude that comes. That demon is the dude that comes to you after you've fallen. So there's a demon before being like, no, you're fine, don't worry, you're good, and God will forgive you, and everything's going to be fine. You're a human, blah blah blah. And then once you've done it, then it's like, no, you're going to die. So there's this constant battle that we go through, and sometimes despair comes with blasphemy. And so it could be a result of psychological illness, as we said, but it could also be from severe depression. I just want to clear up a few common misunderstandings before we get into the case studies that often lead people to not know how to deal with sadness or destructive despair. One is this: some people believe that God is directly responsible for every event in our lives, and thus we have no control over anything, and thus despair is actually rational. This concept means that you don't actually believe in a free will. It means that you actually do think that there's this player in the sky who's moving everybody one by one, and if you do, then yeah, you have every reason to despair. But we don't, as Orthodox Christians, believe this. Another common misconception is that, actually, I think this is part of the first one. Okay, I think it is. So I'm not going to say the next common misconceptions. So for those of you who are not very Egyptian, my apologies. I was using very stereotypical Coptic names. Ebenub, dude number one. He spent the last year studying like crazy for pharmacy school, insert professional school here, which is our obsession. Law school in California is a good example, or med school, but keeps getting rejected. He fasted and prayed like tomorrow's the second coming for it, and to add insult to injury, he's sure that the reason he was rejected is because he is brown. After trying and trying, he becomes withdrawn and loses motivation. He seems like he's heading down a bad route. So for all these, I want you guys to give your insight into what you think is making him feel this way. What's rational, what's irrational? Because I don't need to spew everything out. So what do you guys think of poor Ebenub? Anyone? Go for it.
He thinks that the harder he tries, that there should be a reward that is reaped based on how hard he works for it. So it's almost like he can will God into action by his works.
Very good. What else do you guys think? Is he reasonable? I know somebody in the diocese here that tried law school 3 or 4 times, refused to do anything in the interim, and right now he's upset about it, and then now he's looking to different school options, and this someone in that state seems rational. But is it 100% sound thinking? Because some of it might seem like it. Because forget pharmacy or law school, many of us will have something that we're like, oh, but I prayed for this, I fasted for it, yada yada yada. I don't mind awkward silences, so the more you discuss, the better.
I mean, I think that if he's been rejected several times, that it is rational to perhaps start to find alternatives. I don't know if becoming withdrawn and losing motivation, maybe redirecting your motivation. The third bullet seems like it may or may not be true. It's hard to say from the bullets here, but if it's just an assumption that he's made without any evidence, then that could also be not sound thinking.
So what I'm hoping with each of these people is just to correct sometimes the wrong thinking that we have, right? So he said, for example, that God is not directly responsible for everything that God is not being accept him, reject him, or doing things like that. So it might be that his scores suck. It might be that Ebenub's interview went really badly. And that's life. I don't mean that in a cynical way, where we can't try and make God do something in a particular way if we are actually looking for his will. So if you're adamant on a particular conclusion and you didn't get it, then don't be mad that you didn't get it. That's not anybody's fault, because God never said whatever you want, but everything that you think is good I'm going to just do it, in the same way that our parents don't do that to us, right? We don't, anything our kids say is like, well, it will make me happy if you let me have $5,000 as my weekly allowance. It's like, well, that's nice, but I will not give it to you. But we don't think that's ludicrous. So we do have to kind of understand a bigger, broader context. The second is this wrong connection between asceticism and getting stuff that we want. Is that that's not the purpose of ascetic works. So an ascetic work is something that is moved by love of God. It is not something that's done to kind of connive God into doing something per se. In fact, God said to the Israelites, and read it during Pascha week in the book of Amos, when God says, I reject your fasts. I will not smell your meat offerings in your general assemblies. Who told them to do meat offerings in their general assemblies? God did. Right? Like, this isn't, they didn't make it up. The fast they appointed, like, to be fair. But the meat offerings was something that God had appointed. And he's saying, no, I reject it. Which is to bring our minds to the understanding of intent. That it's what is the purpose of this fast? You just do this because you think these works is somehow a relationship. It's not. In the same way that if you're in a relationship with a human being, right, there's a difference between somebody who's like, I'm going to be up all night talking to you because I actually love talking to you, versus somebody who says, I have designated 2 hours in which I will speak with you because people in relationships speak to one another. One is like coming out of love, the other is a mechanical, robotic thing, where it's just this assumption of thing we're supposed to do. So the same thing with ascetic works. And then when you add irrational thinking, like it's because I'm brown, on what basis have you decided that? You could be mistaken. But if you add wrong thinking upon wrong thinking upon wrong thinking and it becomes real to you, it is likely that you are going to despair, especially if you don't come out of this way of thinking. So we've got to fix that understanding, especially as our relationship with God. And you know what? I'm going to backtrack. I'm sorry I'm disorganized because it wasn't related to the slides. So one misconception is that God only helps us when we do good. And that somehow my badness will make God leave me. And this is not the case. There's another misconception that everything ought to be comfortable. Okay, so a lot of us think that if somebody is a good Christian, that somehow means life is amazing and cheery and rosy. That is a big misconception, because that isn't what Jesus ever said. Jesus said, if you want to follow me, take up your cross and follow me. He said, in this world you're going to have tribulations. He said, they hated me, they're going to hate you. Those were his promises. But he said, I am with you in all of these things. Fear not, for I have overcome the world. Fear not, for I will give you a mouth to speak. Fear not, because I know what you have need of. So we have to not always think that if something goes wrong, that somehow is an indication of the reality of, the state of our relationship with God. Because Christ himself went through an awful lot of hardship on our behalf when he didn't do anything wrong. The other thing is that we sometimes think that carrying a cross is supposed to be done like it's pretty. Like that the best Christian is the one who can always just be like, yeah, I've got cancer, but I am so happy that I have cancer. No, you're probably not. If you are, excellent, like kudos to you, hats off to you. But the majority of us would not be. The majority of us would not be happy that have disease. No one ever said that you must be excited about it. Jesus cried to the point and sweat to the point of blood in Gethsemane, saying, Father, if it be your will, take it away from me. Saint Mary carried in her heart all of the knowledge of what was going to happen to her son her whole life, and there's no way anyone can convince me she was excited about that. There's no way. This is a mom with her son. So we don't have to always think that bearing suffering has to be done excitedly. Okay? And the sooner we realize that, and the more that we can, instead of trying to escape suffering, find Christ in suffering, the sooner you will find that you have peace in the suffering. That's the difference. It's not to pretend you don't suffer. It's to be at peace with suffering. Because despair, in a sense, is an insult to God because it means you don't believe in His mercy. It means that you actually don't believe that He cares for you, which is insulting. It's understandable. I'm just saying it's insulting. Because in the same way that two people that are in a relationship, once there's this level of doubt, the relationship is tainted. Where it's like, well, I don't know if you really care about me. I don't know if you really do. And then you have to resolve that issue. Sometimes it's because you don't understand something, and sometimes it's because you refuse to accept love or the work of the Spirit. That is why Christ said the only unforgivable thing is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. When Blessed Augustine and St. Cyril talk about that verse, they talk about it as meaning somebody who actively refuses to allow God's work in them to the point of their death. And essentially with despair you're limiting His healing ability or grace, because you are refusing a work. So, the next person, Anna Simone. So her whole life, her parents have been telling her how she needs to try harder, needs to get good marks, lose weight, get into a good program. Her female friends are always commenting on her choice of clothes and giggling about how weird she is. And Sunday school, youth group, S&G, sorry, I'm used to calling it that, it's like GYP here. She is constantly taught about how bad her sins are. If she thinks if God is real, He's a jerk. And if heaven is real, sounds like a really terrible place, like ridiculously boring. What do you guys think of this?
She has a terrible support system.
Very terrible support system.
It sounds like she's confusing God with her parents and her friends.
Mm-hmm.
It also sounds like she has a very negative view of the gospel. Rather than a positive theology, she has a very negative and fear-based theology.
Excellent.
It also sounds like she doesn't really know God. Doesn't really know much about Him.
Right. How many of you know an Anna Simone? Not like the name, but like and the personality. Because this is an important thing, and I think this is common, especially in Orthodoxy, actually, sadly, is that we tend to be much more on the legalistic side. It's very easy for an Orthodox Christian to become a Pharisee. And so, consequently, especially when there's cultural baggage mixed in with the religious, we're very critical, right? And we're often very, very fast to point out what is wrong with something and not what is right. Even sometimes in trying to discover God's will, we're overly cautious to the point where you never take an action, which is not a healthy way either, according to the fathers. So if we have this attitude, then it is easy to have misdirected blame. So this person obviously might struggle with self-hatred or low self-esteem, but it is also very easy for her to misdirect the blame for what this is and to come into despair, where it's just like, okay, well, I've done my best and apparently I'm never good enough. This must be God's will, which is another really vague concept for a lot of people. If we don't present a God, and especially particularly to you guys, because many of you probably serve or teach or deal with people, if we present an image of God that can't stand us, don't be shocked if people either hate Him or are constantly living in fear. But we need to present the real image of God. Something's off between my notes and this. I'm sorry, so I'm a bit confused. So we'll come back to it. Vicenti. Vicenti is the dude. So this guy from the gym, the guys from the gym are talking about their girlfriends nonstop, the stuff they do together, being honest with himself. He sort of wishes he had a girlfriend, 2 or today friends with benefits, or whatever common thing there is going on now. Surfing the net for personal research, he stumbles across some bad things. One thing leads to another, and he finds things he wished he never found. Years later, he just cannot stop, but he is a servant. So he's somebody who's actively involved in the ministry, teaching people and doing all of that. Why might he come to despair, and what might be going through his mind? Because it might not be obvious, actually, is one of the things that might be going on here. So what would be going through Basanti's mind as a servant, where he's actively teaching people and taking care of youth? Go for it.
Maybe he feels like shame.
Yes. So he probably feels a ton of shame, where he's like, I'm doing this stuff, right? But I'm supposed to be teaching people the opposite. What else is going on here? Why would I even have this as a slide for despair?
Because he could be losing hope in meeting someone.
In what?
In meeting someone.
Right.
So he could be losing hope.
Okay. What else?
He probably feels like a hypocrite, like he's living two different lives.
Right. So there's two things here that often the scenario can lead to. One is the person who is despairing, contrary to what you might have been obvious in this slide, is pride. A lot of Christians have this weird reaction to sin where they say, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I fell into this sin. Or there's no way I can go back. And this is not who I am. And you think that your assessment of the situation in general, of this potentially something else, is totally accurate. But this is actually self-centered. It's seeing through the eyes or the lens of the self, and not through the eyes of God or of others, and you're limiting the situation to understanding. So this person, a true Christian, a true humble Christian, actually sees himself or herself as capable of doing any wrong thing. Like for me, to be honest, if I hear somebody in confession or come with spiritual guidance say, I would never do that, I'm immediately fearful for them. Immediately. Because I'm like, you're going to fall. Like, you're going to. The minute that you think you're above a temptation, you're going to fall. And almost everything in my life that I said I would never do, I did. And so I was like, God, stop. Like, I get it. Like, message clear. Like, we don't need to do more than this to figure that out. So we've got to make sure that we don't have despair just because we did something wrong, because your source of the fall might have actually been your pride. That you saw yourself as incapable of this, right? In the same way that the root cause of this is, are you hanging around with the right friends? But again, someone said, like, I know my limits. Sure, we'll see about that. That's one extreme. The other extreme in the same situation is somebody having a despair because of a sin that they couldn't overcome, right? So it could go the other way, where he is humble, but he keeps falling, and so he feels ashamed. So both of these are possible. So sometimes we think that because we haven't been able to stop something, that there's no hope, or that I'm too ugly or evil for God, and I have no right to stand before people. But this assumes that in order to be saved, you're required to be perfect, which is not actually what our Lord expects from us. Because Christ said to St. Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And so he says, therefore, I'm going to boast the gospel more proudly, right? That was what he said as a consequence of it. And then this is a quote. There's a wonderful book. If you have not read it, should be mandatory reading, I think, for all Christians. It's written by a Catholic priest, Father Jacques Philippe. It's called Interior Freedom. Very short, but very, very, very powerful book. And he says there are weaknesses God frees us from, but others he leaves with us, precisely so that we stay small and poor, despondent on his grace, compelled to keep calling out to him all the time. And this is a very Desert Fathers-ish type saying, is that sometimes not receiving the grace is so that we remember who we are. So we shouldn't despair of that. It keeps us broken, and it keeps us human, so that we don't go to that other extreme of pride. And it also allows us to serve other people with humility. Because the same person who's dealing with the youth, when the youth comes and tells him, I did this and this and this and this, when you yourself have fallen and you yourself have broken, it's harder for you to look at the person with condescension, or to judge that person and say, how could you do this? Because you know what you do, not what you did, what you still do. Which is why it can be helpful. So let Christ heal you if he wants, and let him use you as a fisherman in the meantime. He called the fishermen as they were. So long as you are struggling for what's right. So I'm not saying this is a license to just do whatever, because we're all sinners, but simply that your being a sinner is not the reason why you don't serve, but be a struggling sinner, not a complacent one. Demiana, she alluded to in the last slide. Demiana knows her limits, but she also wants not to feel totally abnormal. There's a group of people with different morals and values, but it's more convenient for her to chill with them. What does the future look like for her? Why is this in a despair slide?
Because like you said before, someone like, they can't totally know their limits until like they're tested, right? Because, and then like she might change over time because she's hanging out with these people.
Mm-hmm. Very good. If we flirt with danger, don't be surprised if you fall into despair after, right? Like if you play with matches, why wait till you're burnt? Be preventative. Because if you play with matches and you go down the wrong side and you get burnt, you don't know if you're ever going to be able to crawl back, because you might just be so upset by your injury, right? You might be so taken aback by how badly you got burnt. You might feel that this is so hideous the way that I look now that I can't come back. But why take that risk? So not just dealing with despair when you're in it, but don't do the things that will lead you there. Again, if we have the humility, we should never see ourselves as incapable of doing something wrong, or we will definitely do it.
So you're saying there's no associated feeling with that, with despair, necessarily?
Where there's no what, sorry?
No feeling, no emotion.
There can be, but it might not be clear what it came from. But what I'm trying to say is, if you leave yourself to that point, you may end up in despair and feel all these negative feelings, but not be able to pinpoint what led to it. But it was because you left yourself. One of the quotes I didn't read that went with that slide was about the Desert Fathers, where the Desert Fathers were warning the monks not to live near the city. They're like, if you live near the city, don't be shocked when you lose your discipline. And then when you lose your discipline, you're not going to be able to read anymore. You're not going to be able to pray anymore. And then you're not able to read or pray anymore, you're going to feel like you're a crappy monk. And then if you feel like you're a crappy monk, then you might just leave it. And all of it was nonsensical because you simply put yourself in the wrong place. It's like deciding you can go pray the Book of Hours at the nightclub. It doesn't make any sense. You're not going to keep your eyes closed. It's just not possible. So we have to be honest with ourselves about who we are and what our weaknesses are, because otherwise we can fall. I've given this example to some people before, where my church from Canada came to visit last summer, and they went to Newport, and it was the surfing open day. So I usually if I go to a beach, I just go to a one that's empty that I can read and no one's actually there. But it was live porn, straight up. It was thousands of people that were unclothed. For me, as a celibate, this doesn't make any sense, right? This is not the right place for me to be. So I tell them, okay, peace out. I'm going to go work at a place until you guys are done. Hit me up and we'll join. But not try and fool myself I know my limits, I'm going to keep my head down, I'll pray Jesus prayer. But your prayers have to be in line with your intentions, right? You can't say Lord, deliver me from temptation as you're walking to the temptation, right? Then this doesn't make any sense. And so don't be shocked when you fall after and then be where were you? I told you not to go. But you decided you're going to go. So don't misdirect blame, don't be presumptuous, and do things like that. Ammonius, he used to love the Tizbaha thing. Tizbaha is the midnight praises, the vigils, and the liturgy stuff. It got to be a little bit too taxing, and besides, chilling is way more fun. And it doesn't mean that you don't still love God. Slowly goes from zeal to just being a normal guy, taking it easy and chilling with the boys. What could be a cause of despair from this lifestyle?
Like going through the motions, they don't really feel anything anymore.
Very good. Desensitization. What else? What else could be dangerous about this thing?
Being lukewarm.
Excellent. You guys are really like short today, like your sentences. Because this is common. John, go for it.
I think like it's kind of telling the beginning of the second bullet says it became a little bit too taxing. So when the things of God become taxing, that's a sign that you're not really as into God, right? And I think there's like some justification towards the end.
He got out of his comfort zone. He wasn't comfortable anymore.
Right.
Like I think he's justifying because at the very end he's like, well, I can still love God and just not have to do anything. Like it's fine.
Right.
I think it's more than it being taxing, it's that he just stopped trying. So even if it is a struggle, he's not even struggling, he just stopped.
Right. Because this is one of the most common things that happen in the spiritual life today. Like most people are like this dude, insert activity here. So he started off by loving it, right? And sometimes we do get bored. It's not unusual for a person to get bored. It's not unusual for monks to get bored. It's a very common thing. But the problem that can arise is if we decide to only chill all the time and think that that's going to rescue us, because it results in internal stagnation, disinterest, this lukewarmness that you guys were talking about, this lack of motivation, which in turn leads to lack of goals, because you suddenly just don't have any kind of benchmark. There's nothing going on. And so you actually lose your footing. And then they're not actually sure why they're doing anything, period, like of any kind. And so it becomes an easy time to experiment with different things as a way of distraction. Not finding contentment, they might despair of life and its meaning. I'm going to read two quotes from here about this. One from St. Theophan de Recluse, another one from the big boss of Antony. As long as man lives in spiritual repose, or spiritual kind of resting state, and loves the quiet of the cell, little by little he might progress, so long as he's staying quietly in his place. Obviously for non-monks this just means in your state of spiritual life of actually working. It doesn't mean you have to have a cell. One step at a time according to the order of succession. And he has hope that in our Lord he will be able to vanquish each of the passions, and that through his repose and labors he'll acquire spiritual excellence in the grace of Christ. So he's saying this is the ideal, that a person just continues to always do some work. However, if the life becomes tedious or boring to him, and he goes forth and leaves his cell and wanders about, he will neither vanquish the passions nor acquire virtues, but he will incline to despair and to utter destruction. Note how it's like an immediate association with despair. Therefore the fathers have well said that no war is more cruel than the war of wandering. Like, it's almost better to like not be in a state of warfare than to have nothing in here and just do whatever you feel like all the time. Because this leads to you not even having a goal or a purpose. And then when you're confronted with reality, it's shocking. And actually this is something we see in society a lot. Almost anybody who takes time to shut up from social media for like half an hour and confront themselves in silence, it's very uncomfortable. And some people find it very unnerving. One person was like, I tried it, I was freaked out, and I had to like turn on music because there's nothing going on in here, and there's nothing going on in here. And if nothing is going on, everything is acceptable to you, and you lose meaning. So it's important to have that. This other story is one of St. Antony that's very famous, but I like this translation because of what it says his warfare was. So they tell a story that once, while St. Antony was dwelling in the desert, thoughts of dejection and despair rose up in his mind, and he was deep in deep gloom of thought. So he's actually down. He's not just like, I'm bored. He's down and he's depressed and he's in despair. And he says to God, Lord, I want to live, but my thoughts don't permit me to do so. What shall I do in my tribulations to be saved? And he came a little near from the place where he was, and he saw a man who was like unto himself, and wore his own uniform, and he was sitting down and twisting palm leaves into ropes. So this vision that he sees is a monk dressed like himself. He prays a little, eats a little, and sleeps a little, and the person says to him, O Antony, do this, and you will live. And when Antony heard this, the blessed man had great joy, and afterwards he did as the angel had done and lived. So, what he's saying, what the response to this is to work. Okay? He's like, you need to rest. There's no denying that. There's a time for sleep. So there is a time to relax and to have a chill time. There's nothing wrong with that. But that can't be your whole life. There needs to be an element of work. So there is supposed to be an effort involved. And even if you think of a normal relationship, if everybody's kind of like, no, I just want to be in the honeymoon phase all the time, well, sorry, good luck when it's not that case anymore. Because you're going to have a fight. And there's going to be days where you can't stand seeing each other, hearing each other. And there's going to be days where you're just not in the mood to have a conversation. If we go by every mood and just be like, whatever, since I don't like how I'm feeling right now, I will leave. And I'm going to just chill. Then how do you ever increase or strengthen the bond of your relationship? You will not be able to. And the same thing is true of God. And so when you do this, the zeal turns to coldness. The only thing that I would add to this is that I made up Amuniz, but like in some cases, Amuniz has been doing too much. So like it is important that there is a balance. Like you need a good spiritual father to make sure that your spiritual practices are not overboard. Because if you are gung ho over the top, then you are going to hate it. Syncletica and Sammy, in two similar cases. Simply, they're both suffering. Syncletica, after being an active athlete for years, gets into a terrible accident, is on pain meds constantly, can't do the things she used to do. Sammy is also suffering. He can barely make ends meet. He barely eats. He sees that others seem to have everything. It all looks so bleak. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think? Because sometimes despair is a cause of our stupidity, but sometimes it has nothing to do with something that we did.
Is that across the bear?
Sorry?
Is that across the bear?
It might be, but is that what we tell them? Should it just be like, so it's sucks to be you, bro?
I think a question to ask is, where is God in this? Why? Not to question God like as though no hope, but why are they in that situation? It's not necessarily thorns, because there's roses in this too. And so, I can't preach about that, but there could be good things about it, I guess. It's a sort of attitude, or sort of perspective in suffering. There's a sort of, there could be benefits to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's real though.
Yeah. So what should our perspective be?
It seems like they have both cases have two choices. They can focus on, they can focus on all the ways that they're in a bad state, or they can try to focus on God. So, or just having a deeper connection to God.
What think you all?
And you mentioned this earlier. You said that sometimes people, if you have cancer, you're not obligated to just take it in stride and be happy about it. Like it's okay to suffer and have a hard time with it, but the key is to attempt to find Christ in the suffering, right?
So this is obviously a very difficult one, and it's real, and it's important for us to recognize because we're very good at preaching Jesus, but until you're put in a situation like this, it can be hard, and almost everyone's reaction is the whole "where is God" thing, which comes back to the more important question of where does suffering come from, and when did we get told we weren't going to suffer? So we are going to suffer, and the whole where does suffering and evil come from, that's a whole other talk on its own, but it is not from Him. Like, that was not God's design. God's design was never to suffer. Nor does He stand up from above and be like, I'll give that one cancer, and I'm going to give that one this, and this one this. That's not how it works. And if we have that belief, you are going to suffer. Like, because then it's going to be very hard not to throw blame if you think that that's what's going on.
But isn't this from God, though? Isn't suffering from God?
Why?
I mean, something like cancer is not something that, you make a sin, that's your choice, that's your will. But something like this is not your will. It's like the people who were born blind. And Jesus healed them, and He said, this is for the glory of God. I'm not going to say that you tell that to a person who's got cancer, but at the same time, God might have allowed it for a reason, for their salvation, if anything.
So God's allowance is only in terms that He didn't miraculously intervene and change it. But did God give them the cancer? Let me ask you another question. I always use this same one over and over. If a woman who's pregnant takes drugs, what's going to happen to the child when it's born?
Yeah, so that's something, so the child will be impaired or whatever.
Right, and will be born addicted. Could you say that God willed this child to be addicted? Could you say that God is punishing this child for the sins of his mother?
But that's not punishment, though.
No, I'm just asking, are either one of those the right conclusion to take from this case?
No, but that's not necessarily punishment, but that's the way it is with the child.
Sure.
They're going through, they don't know any better, though.
Right.
So stuff was an accident.
But what I'm saying is, can we put anything on God in this case? I'm not judging the girl. I'm just asking, does God have anything to do with this? So my point is that free will, if we understand it properly, affects other people.
Yeah.
What is cancer? Cancer is sometimes a genetic thing. It's something has happened, usually an environmental cause, that causes a cell to no longer replicate properly, and it goes out of whack. This is from pollution. This is from how we treat the world. This is from our technologies. This is from the radiation. So we can't say that God willed for this person to have it. It's unfortunate that this person has it, but it is also not a right conclusion to say that God gave her cancer and that was really nice of Him.
There's a difference between allowing and gave. That's what I guess.
Right. So God permitting, we also have to understand, did every human being that was alive during the time of Christ get healed of their diseases? No. Okay? So God can work a good through any evil. Okay? But we also shouldn't attribute the evil to that when there's an actual cause to it. And the people that He healed, they still died. Right? And someone was upset when they died. Right? Like, no matter what way you want to look at it, something's going to happen that's seen as an evil. Where does it come from? So we have to be careful not to have wrong attributes towards it and say, okay, well, God willed for this person to have cancer. That's why St. James says very clearly, let no man, when he is tempted by evil, say that he is tempted by God. God does not do that. Because God does not do anything like that.
I think I'm confused when He's saying He willed it just as He allowed it. I think maybe I'm confused with this.
Because an allowance is to say, well, God didn't actively intervene and change it. Right? Because in terms of the allowance of God is that, yes, He is omnipotent. So could He, if He wanted, step in and stop this person from having cancer?
Yeah,
He could.
He could.
Okay? But did He say, I'm going to give you cancer? Right? Which is what most people talk as though that's the case.
Yeah.
So whether they're healed or not, and why God heals and not heals, this is a whole other topic of discussion. Maybe if we have time, then we can address it. Right? But we have to be careful not to mix those two things. Because we sometimes say, oh, God was so kind, He allowed them to have disease so that, they could be purified, or they could be blah, blah, blah. I mean, we have to be very careful of saying things like that, because you're saying a very bold thing on behalf of God, which might be totally wrong. And so that does way more damage and leads to way more despair, because then the next question is obviously, well, thanks, I was better off without it. My spiritual life was better off before it. My family was suffering less before it. So what is the benefit? Right? And so and that's a very fair set of questions to ask. But if we don't understand suffering properly and its context and where it comes from, the wrong conclusion will very surely lead a person to despair. Because these are some of the most fundamental questions of philosophy and the meaning of life, right? Is all of those things. But this also requires a certain level of faith, which is not easy. Because if you really believe the gospel, not just in a word, but if you actually believe the gospel, then our focus is on the resurrection, right? Like our focus is actually not on this life. Yes, there's suffering and there's pain. So some people will scoff at that and be like, yeah, it's easy for you to say it'll all be better in heaven. Where it's like, okay, well then that's why I'm saying it's a question of faith. Because if you don't believe in that, then go find yourself a faith that answers your question. That's fine. But we believe in that. So if we don't believe in that, then you need to check yourself on what exactly is it that you believe. And a lot of the times these, I don't say conundrums, these catastrophes is a stronger thing, are what confront us to our real belief. Is how do I actually deal with it when I'm in it? When I lost a nephew 38 days, I had to deal with evil in a different way. Right? Of like, why is he dead? Like, why is this infant dead? Right? So, and it challenges us. But we do need to question ourselves of, do I actually believe? Because if you don't believe, then you will not know how to deal with the suffering. It'll be much, much harder. But that's why Christ says a woman when she's in labor has pain. Right? It is very painful. Well, now there's epidurals, but before epidurals, it was excruciatingly painful. And most people weren't enjoying that moment. But the minute that a new child is born, their joy eclipses the sorrow that they had before it, and even in some cases allows them to have another one. But if we focus only on the present moment, we might not be able to see any greater good that could happen. Like if an Olympian, while training for the competition, is only focused on the pain and the ardor and the lack of sleep and the early mornings and all this stuff, then he's losing sight of the whole thing. And so if he only is able to focus on, I feel like garbage right now, I can't eat this, I can't do this, I can't go out with my friends, I can't get wasted, I can't blah, blah, blah. Well, if that's all you think about, you'll be unhappy. So you have to ask yourself, do you care about the Olympics? Yes or no? If you do, then it's worth it. If you don't, then find yourself something that you do believe in. So we have to do the same thing as Christians. And sometimes it makes us think that, like in these things, that if I'm going through hardship, it means that I'm loved less. When in Christianity, actually, it's the opposite. The person that you care for the most is someone who will share in your sufferings, not the person who pretends it's not there. It's more meaningful to walk the way of pain with others than it is to reject pain, which is what Christ did, right? Like he didn't scoff at pain. He took every single one of them. And actually, from the mouths of babes and sucklings, somebody was telling me about a little kid in their Sunday school class a couple of weeks ago who had a beautiful meditation just in the middle of Sunday school and said how, like this kid who was like grade 5 or something, was amazed that Jesus walked to the cross and had to deal with the insults and the jeering every step of the way. Like it wasn't just like, okay, where's my cross? Let's go to the hill, let's go. Right? But there's this painful, arduous walking and taking on small abuses on the way to the big one. He didn't shy from sufferings. And that's why the message of the gospel and the epistles is that we suffer. Right? That's why, here's like a bunch of verses. But rejoice in as much as you are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, you may be glad also with exceeding joy. The Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds by Christ. And so in this, I think it's important to kind of talk a little bit about how to deal with that kind of thing, is to combat with prayer, to turn your tribulations into prayer, coupling it with the Bible, of course, if you don't articulate your pain, you're not going to find relief, right? Like the patient needs to tell the healthcare provider that they're in pain. There's nothing wrong with that. So express that pain easily. But one of the best things to do when you're suffering is to serve other people, is to combat self-pity, which is understandable. I'm not even saying it condescendingly, with self-denial. Because when we serve other people, it allows you to see your situation in a larger context. They've actually done studies about terminally ill patients and oncology patients doing community service, and it improved their quality of life. Because stepping out of yourself to what you're able to do, obviously, is helpful. I don't know how many of you have read Father Arseni. That's another book that if you have not read, like, you must read. Father Arseni, prisoner, spiritual father. He saw the worst of humanity. He was in a prison, a special prison in Russia during the communist regime, where they were trying to systematically eradicate all religion, which the primary religion obviously in Russia is Orthodoxy, and they murdered millions of clergy, monks, laity, everything. And they were very, there's no word for the kind of disgusting depravity that went on in those places. And Father Arseni did not shy actually from saying to God, "Where are you?" Like, he asked that. There's nothing wrong with being honest in the pain of saying, what part of my language, what the hell is going on here? Because it feels like hell. But at the same time, in his context of this prison, he was healing people. Like, he was raising them up and brought them joy and peace and solace in the middle of destruction. And so once we're able to do that, you can find contentment and peace and joy even in the middle of the darkest hours. The last case study, sorry, I went a little longer than I was expecting. Moses, or Musa. Musa's your star servant, star athlete. He's like you're your model dude in every aspect. And I bring this up because I know somebody in Canada that something similar happened. Just one night, messed up. Just a little bit too much to drink. The girl was there, and everything he believed in came crashing down. Actually, this person was on suicide watch for a bit because he was so disengaged from himself. He didn't know who he was. He was rocked. And he couldn't deal with himself. I was kind of surprised at how dramatic the response was, but it was. What do you think of this person?
So would it be another issue of pride that he couldn't believe that happened to him, or that he did that?
Yes. Very much so. What else?
He's forgotten the repentance side of our belief system. He's seen the death without the resurrection.
Very good. So sometimes major sin can lead us to despair, like one huge one. And as I said earlier, one of the Egyptian elders said, this is the way the demons work. After causing a soul to fall into sin, they cast it into despair to destroy us completely. The demons are always saying to the soul, when will his name die and be destroyed? Which is from the Psalms. If the soul is a sober one, or like a properly thinking one, it will answer and say, I shall die, yes, I have sinned, but shall live, and declare the works of the Lord. Is that the experience of this fall might bring the experience of resurrection, which becomes a source of preaching. And St. Peter of Damascus from the Eastern Church, it is always possible to make a new start by means of repentance, as you were saying, John. You fell, it is written, now arise. If you fall again, then rise again, without despairing at all of your salvation, no matter what happens. So long as you do not surrender yourself willingly to the enemy, your patient endurance combined with self-reproach will suffice for your salvation. And he quotes some things from St. Paul saying the same thing. The analogy one Athanasius in Canada used to always give me, that I've used in the sermons a lot, but I will not tire from using, is to understand the concept that you are in a war. If somebody is in a war and is injured, we are not angry with the person who was injured. We see them as a valiant fighter who is worthy of honor. We'll heal them. If they can keep fighting, they keep fighting. If they can't, they can't. But we're not angry with them. If somebody dies in battle, we're naming highways after them, or freeways, whatever you call them in America. And you're putting up signs on them in towns. In the Corona area, they have like these banners put up over the light posts honoring these people. So why do we think that God is going to be angry because you were fighting and got injured or fell? And so one of the other sayings from the Desert Fathers is that a young monk comes to the elder and says, "Father, I fell. What do I do?" And he said, "Get up." And he goes, "Okay, well, if I fall again?" And he goes, "Get up again." And he goes, "And if I fall again?" He goes, "Get up again." And he goes, "Until when do I keep doing this?" And he goes, "Till you die standing up or you die standing." Like, it's very simple. So we don't have to have this despair. And combat yourself with the reality of the Gospels. Look at the stories of everybody in the Bible and see how God dealt with a person who had just a shred of regret for doing something that wasn't right. The woman that was caught in adultery didn't even come of her own will. She was forced in front of him. She didn't come like, "I'm so excited to get forgiveness." She was coming because they were going to kill her. Right? And God dealt with her kindly. King David. We all talk about King David's fall because it was a big fall. But think about when King David fell. King David didn't fall when he was like some newbie in religious life who had never had an experience with God. King David fell after he had gone through a whole lifetime of experience with God, seen his will, seen his work, been anointed, which is equivalent today of becoming a priest or a bishop, okay, heard the voice of God directly, done all sorts of crazy, wonderful things, and he still fell into adultery and murdered. And he was forgiven. So combat yourself with this. The thief on the right. It just took 2 seconds and he got a really good deal. So we have to combat this despair with the reality of the Gospels if you believe. If you believe, then you have nothing to worry about so long as you care. But just fight. If you're not fighting, the one soldier that we do tear apart and kill and like shame and blot out their names is the one who mutinies. The one who walks away and joins the enemy side. But the person who is in the battle, no matter what their strength is, are going to. And understand that God is not looking for us to be 100% successful all the time. Okay? He just wants us to be in relationship. When people get married, they're not expecting that the person will never have a flaw for the rest of their lives. Right? There's an understanding of that. It's whether we love beyond that carries us through. I'm not going to read the Sarah thing, but I want to point out that sometimes there are people who do a lot of good works. And this is more true of the very religious people, and it's a very common monastic issue. Abu Naimat al-Miskin, Father Matthew the Poor, wrote extensively about this, where a monk might start off, for example, by doing a lot of good works, where he's doing 1 billion prostrations and matanyas and fasting and abstaining and doing all sorts of things, and suddenly finds that he's not able to do it anymore. And so he feels himself getting cold, and so he might go and say, "Well, I'm going to do what I used to do." He'll go back to whatever his original rule was and find that he's not able to do that either. Sometimes God allows this so that we understand that we don't earn his love. We don't, no matter what. That's not a Protestant concept. We don't earn God's love. God's love is in spite of us. So sometimes we start to think that our worth before God is in a specific amount of deeds. And that is not how it works. Like we said at the very beginning, an ascetic work needs to be done in love. And if it's not done in love, it's just an action. So, like, a person who wants to do vigil shouldn't be doing a vigil because holy people do vigil. Otherwise, you'll get bored of it very soon. But if you can think of vigil, again, the reason I keep on coming back to romantic relationships is because God used that to model our relationship with Him, is think of a new couple. They can text till like 4 or 5 in the morning, even though they know they're going to be dead tired at work the next day. But they're excited to do it because they're in love. So there's different ways of expressing love at different phases, and we need to understand that. But that work of staying up was an expression of real love. But if it were to then switch to, well, since at the beginning we stayed up all night and we're having problems right now, let's stay up all night and text again. Right? Like, that's not going to solve your relationship problem. Right? So we sometimes don't understand that level of relationship when we're dealing with God. Just a couple of quick pointers. Protect yourself from despair by don't lock yourself into the negative. This is something so common that I see, like, with the people who are struggling with this, is that they've decided to not ever see good. And almost nobody can convince them to see good. And when you point out good to them, they get angry. Where it's just like, no, but he didn't do this because he likes me, he did this because he had to. Or like, no, but this could have been because of blah, blah, blah. And everything is just negative. So watch yourself and reflect. And I saw this in particular, actually, when I left one environment for another. I was in an environment where there was a lot of garbage going on, and there was a lot of politics, and there was a bad spirit in the church. Where just everyone was pointing at everything negative. And when I left it, I was spending time with somebody for a while, one of the priests, and all the conversation was positive. And if I was like pointing out something that I thought was inappropriate, I'm like, oh yeah, that, haha, like with a cynical kind of laugh, he'd be very quick to kind of change the subject, point out something good, and redirect it. And so all of our conversations only became good. And so I found myself resensitized to negativity. That when I went back to visit that environment, I was annoyed. I'm like, why do we just have to talk about how bad the whole world is? Like, why can't we just have fun? Right? Why can't we have a pleasant conversation? Why do we need to point out how like dumb this person is, or how wrong this person is, or how this guy has become more Protestant, or this church has got the worst bishop, and this blah blah blah, and yada yada. And it's just like, seriously guys, like at the end of the day, is this all you care about? Because if we surround ourselves, if we lock into the negative, you will find it easier to get into despair. Don't look for wrong, look for good. And surround yourself with people who are positive. If you're in a group that is very cynical, like I was saying, it will affect you. So I'm not saying don't be a realist, but don't be a cynic either, because that will affect your mental health and your spiritual health. Because especially if you read that book, Interior Freedom, you will find very quickly that there is nothing outside of yourself that you can control. Nothing. You can't control that you were born. You can't control the government. You can't control who your priest is. You can't control who goes to school or work or anything. None of that is in your control. So the sooner you realize that and accept it, the easier you'll be able to deal with it. Where what you can control is your internal response and your reaction to it, and whether or not you are willing to bear suffering, whether you are willing to be happy, and whether you are willing to focus on Christ. That is where you have control and authority to have freedom. And there's an example in that book that I loved of a Christian woman who was in a concentration camp during World War II, who, when they had locked them up in cages, said that she felt sorry for the people on the other side of the cage. And she's like, they are the ones that are locked up. And I'm not going to spoil why she said that, but it was a very beautiful story. But if you can control your interior state, you will find that you have freedom from everything. And to end with just a word of comfort is what Christ said, that there's no temptation that comes upon you that is not common, that has not been seen before. Everybody has been through these things. However, God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation He'll also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. He'll either give you the grace or the exit if you permit Him. And glory be to God forever and ever. Amen. Any questions, comments, concerns?
You were talking about the couple that's that's in love and they're texting each other in the beginning, but then they don't but then they don't, but then something happens, and so like, as an analogy, in that relationship to God, it seems like it's very difficult to just like, to not, have it not be an action afterwards, where if you don't have that, like that crush, or that feeling of like, love for God, and so, but you're supposed to do like your evening prayers or something, if you're not in that honeymoon state anymore, how is it not in action? Like, what is the deeper love there? What's the feeling you're supposed to have? Or
So there's two things. One is you're supposed to grow. So as you grow in a relationship, you discover more knowledge about one another, and that knowledge is what keeps things new, right? So as you learn more and more about God, you encounter Him in new ways, and that's a very real experience. And that's why even if you look at, there's a lot of monastic adages where, like, one, for example, is when the monastery bells ring, the novice goes to church, the elder goes to his cell. Even though for the novice that's a rule, right? So as you advance and grow, you will naturally find there's a new way to experience it. Second is that the reason for a rule, so there's nothing wrong with having ritualistic consistency, but the reason for that rule is because we know that we're not always in the mood to pray. And so there has to be something to kind of force us to keep it alive. So, for example, the husband might come home, or the wife, really tired, but they'll still have a meal together, even though they might not feel like talking. Is that love? It is, right? Is it expressed the same way as like talking about 5 billion things during the meal? It is still the same love, just expressed completely differently. And just like as a couple gets to know one another, they might actually be comfortable sitting in silence with one another. And what Theophan actually talks about, there's a couple of places where he appears to, St. John of Kronstadt, where he appears to contradict himself, because he's like, if you have a rule, keep it. And in other places he says, don't be attached to the rule. Because the idea is that the rule is to keep your discipline, but if you're expressing something in love, continue to do it. Because it's a natural expression. Again, as long as there's a good guide to watch when it's just pure emotion and not real. That kind of answer? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, developing the relationship takes effort. That's why, like in one of the examples where it's like, if you end up just wandering, you actually won't grow. Instead of growing, you're gonna get colder. I see buckets. All right. Now the love of God, the Father, grace, Holy God, Son, the communion and gift of the Holy Spirit, you all go in peace. Peace, Lord, be with you all. You don't have to go because there's snacks in the back, and you guys can chill for a bit.